Today we are looking at migration policies, and we're looking specifically at the EU migration crisis that started in the summer of 2015. And the question that I want to ask is whether the migration crisis will have a huge impact on borders and on migration policies in the European Union. The reason I want to focus on these two questions is that I think the EU, in a way, has been unlucky to be confronted with a fundamental transformation of migration flows in a very at a time that is very unexpected. But that as a result of this, the EU is a very interesting lab to study the reaction in states, the EU member states, but also at the level of the European Union, and to see how it has transformed to a certain extent, for some in depth, for others not enough, both borders and migration policies. One of the first things that we need to know is that there were specific causes to the migration into the EU, and I want to look at those. The EU also reacted, and so I question, how did the EU react to the migration crisis, and how come it was unexpected? And thirdly, I want to ask a question that lots of people ask in the media, which is the EU fundamentally transformed? Is, for instance, the EU so affected by the migration crisis that it will disappear or that it will transform its own nature in a very fundamental way? And also a last question, which is specific to border policies, is the migration crisis transforming some of the EU policies radically? It's, taking them off the table, they have to be entirely rethought, and I'm thinking obviously about Schengen. So what were the causes of the migration policy? And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is to look at flows. It's to look at the number of people who attempted to enter the EU illegally before 2015. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that the number is multiplied by 4, and that the average over the last previous 5 years was around 200,000 a year. So when we look at, an evolution of the number of people who try to attempt to enter the EU, there is a progression from about 100,000 to about 240 or 250,000, and then that number increases in 2015 suddenly to 1 million. So from 1 year to the next, the number of people who try to enter the EU is multiplied by 4. But that number is much greater when we look at specific regions of the EU, because these people enter the EU through certain EU member states. Not all EU member states are concerned with that. And that's a very important aspect also of that transformation. So when we look at the history of the migration into the EU, let's say the last 20 years, the state that is really at the forefront of welcoming migrants is Spain. Morocco, who is a neighborhood state, who has a relationship with Spain but also with the European Union, at the time is considered not a destination, but a state that is crossed by migrants. That's not where the migrants want to stop, but it is where the migrants basically cross to go into Spain. And one of the things that we noticed in 2014, 2015, and since 2015, is that actually the number of people who are trying to enter the EU through Morocco or Spain has dropped tremendously. So for instance, 2014, 2015, the number of people who are trying to enter through Spain is stable. But the number of people who are trying to enter through one of the Balkan states is increasing by almost 100 120%, 100% when we look at the different states. So for instance, if we look at specifically at Turkey, there is well over 100% increase in the number of people that are transiting through Turkey to try to enter through Greece, or any of the other Balkan states like Romania and Czechia and so on and so forth. Hungary, not Czechia. Other states like Romania and Hungary that are basically at the forefront of the Balkan state and the Balkan countries are confronted with this. So one of the very important factors here is that rapid increase in the number of people who are trying to enter the EU illegally, and the fact that from being an Eastern problem, it becomes a Western problem. Spain, from the 1980s, had time to organize and develop know-how policies, but also administrative capacity, not just focus on security, but also health, education, and social issues to welcome migrants. Whereas the states that are on the eastern side of Europe that now are confronted with this issue, such as Romania and Hungary and even Greece, have not had the history to develop these capacities. There is a fundamental issue here, is that those states don't even have the know-how, and yet they are confronted with sheer increase in the number of people who are trying to enter the EU there. Another problem, which is the last one I want to identify, is the diversity of people who are trying to enter. And that makes basically the EU crisis of 2015 a global crisis, because when we look at the diversity of the origin, the countries of origin of these people, the diversity is increasing, and it's not just the Syrian war that is at stake here. It's not just the fact that you have camps in that part of the Mediterranean region, that, you know, we look at Lebanon, we look at Syria, but we have to go much farther. We look at Eritrea, we look at Sudan, we look at Pakistan, we look at Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And so the number and diversity of people, and the diversity means a complexity, because when we welcome people from so many different countries, we also have to be able to communicate with them. We also have to be able to do the security work, but also the social and medical assistance work, and so on and so forth, which makes the whole issue extremely complex. The EU was completely surprised by this issue. Nobody in the EU in 2012 or 13 or even 14 saw the arrival of these migrants in the forecast. Nobody actually had any clue that it would happen. At the time, the EU of 2015, and I would say that from the beginning of 2015 or from the fall 2014, when the new Juncker Commission comes in the office to manage the European Commission and to basically give EU Commission and EU politics a new life, people were focusing on energy crisis. They were not focusing on the migrant crisis that arrived basically within the next few months. Now, is that going to impact the EU? Well, in the EU, there are two regulations that are fundamental that organize migration and border type policies. The Dublin Agreement, or Dublin Regulation of 2003, is one of them, and the second one is the Schengen Agreement. The Dublin Regulation is a regulation that basically says, in summary, that the state within which, the member state within which a migrant steps foot is responsible to welcome the migrant. One of the issues with this policy, obviously, is that if you step into the EU in Spain or in Romania, as I was saying earlier, because the policy, administrative capacity is very different, the treatment of that migrant will be very different. And this is something that had been identified fairly early including by the European Parliament as early as 2008. So soon after Dublin, 2003, is passed, 5 years within, when the Parliament looks into the implementation of the policy, they basically, the parliamentarians basically argue that the Dublin regulation is unfair to both asylum seekers and to certain member states, because it becomes the work of southern member states of the European Union to welcome migrants. Greece, Romania, Hungary, Spain, Italy, Portugal, to a certain extent. And yet, when you welcome thousands, tens of thousands of people, even if it's only to register them and allow them to stay in the EU, it has a cost. And other member states are not fully responsible, or in a way do not act in full solidarity until 2015-16, when things start to change. So the Dublin regulation obviously is faced with serious reforms. Now, does this mean it's the end of the EU? Well, actually, it's much more complex than this. And the view that I would like to put forth here is that what we see is a fundamental transformation and strengthening of the EU. So the European Commission, but also the ability EU member states have to work together on both those issues, the protection of their border, the integrity of the European member state borders, but also the ability to welcome migrants. Both the Schengen agreement and the Dublin regulation end up strengthened by the crisis. When we look at all the reforms that have been implemented since, we see that, for instance, the internal security strategy manages to obtain almost 4 billion euros in funding to help strengthen all of the different aspects that have to do with internal security. Similarly, when we look at the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, we see almost 4 billion being poured into that fund to basically help the peripheral member states of the EU work effectively. And that means the states that are at the forefront of the migration conundrum, if you want, become the key actors, and they have capacity to act then, if only financial capacity to a certain extent. That's only the big picture. But 4 billion and 3.8 billion is a significant amount of money, which obviously shows that the European Union, the European Commission, but the European Union as a set of body of institutions have tremendous power to act. And we see the creation of a European agency that basically has to help border guards across Europe. We also see, in a way, the strengthening of the Schengen Agreement. So all in all, it's very interesting to look at this crisis, because it allows us to understand how the EU, in a way, proceeds, and how crises, in a way, participate in more European integration, but also in this case have strengthened both the migration and the borders of Europe. Thank you very much. Happy reading.